As the conflict dragged on into another harsh season, Lucas felt time stretch in unfamiliar ways, because endurance changed the shape of days and nights, and he no longer expected relief, only continuation. His body adapted to long hours of focus, yet his mind carried fatigue that surfaced in quiet moments when he allowed himself to rest. And during those moments, he reminded himself why he continued, because meaning had replaced comfort. The resistance relied on him now not only for delivery, but for stability, because his consistency reassured those around him, and his calm presence helped steady others whose fear threatened to overwhelm them. He learned that leadership did not require command or visibility, and that influence could exist quietly through reliability and trust. Messages grew more urgent as resources diminished, and plans became riskier, and Lucas adjusted again, refining his internal systems so that even under strain, clarity remained intact. He trained himself to recover quickly from mistakes, recognizing them instantly and correcting without panic, and this skill saved lives more than once. There were nights when he sensed danger approaching before anyone else, because sound carried warning long before action followed, and he learned to speak up even when certainty was incomplete. His parents aged visibly during this time, and Lucas heard the toll in their voices, yet they never asked him to stop, because they understood that asking would wound him more deeply than fear ever could. The town suffered losses, and Lucas carried those losses within him, not as grief alone, but as responsibility to continue. He played more often for civilians as well as officers, because music offered rare comfort, and these performances carried no code, yet they strengthened resolve in quieter ways. Children gathered near windows to listen, and Lucas recognized hope in their voices, and this knowledge reinforced his belief that his role mattered beyond tactics. The resistance faced betrayal again, and trust tightened further, and Lucas responded by simplifying structures, reducing exposure, and focusing on essentials. He worked closely with a few individuals whose integrity had been proven, and this smaller circle moved with greater efficiency despite increased risk. One night he narrowly avoided capture when an officer questioned his movements, yet his steady tone and unremarkable presence deflected suspicion, and routine protected him. Afterward he shook not from fear but from awareness of proximity, and he allowed himself a moment of release before returning to discipline. As spring approached, rumors of change circulated quietly, and Lucas sensed a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle loosening in sound and movement. The resistance prepared for transition, and Lucas carried messages that spoke of possibility rather than survival, and this change brought cautious hope. He understood that endings carried their own dangers, and that vigilance mattered until certainty arrived. This period tested patience more than courage, and Lucas learned to hold restraint as firmly as action. He remained focused, grounded in the skills that had carried him this far, and ready for whatever came next. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. As the tide of the war began to shift, Lucas sensed change before anyone spoke of it openly, because sound carried anticipation just as clearly as fear, and the town breathed differently with steps that held less urgency and voices that no longer fell silent as quickly. Checkpoints remained, yet the rhythm around them softened, and Lucas understood that uncertainty was giving way to cautious expectation, and this transition demanded as much discipline as the darkest days had. The resistance adjusted its focus from survival toward preparation, and Lucas' role shifted again, not in visibility, but in purpose, because the messages he carried now involved coordination, timing, and restraint, rather than constant warning. He memorized fewer messages, yet each one held greater consequence, because the margin for error narrowed as plans moved closer to action. His internal systems evolved once more, becoming leaner and more precise, and he stripped away anything unnecessary, keeping only what served clarity and reliability. This refinement brought a sense of calm, because simplicity reduced strain, and allowed him to move with confidence even as stakes remained high. His parents noticed the change in him not as relief but as steadiness, and his mother remarked quietly that he sounded older, not in years but in certainty. His father listened without comment, understanding that some transformations did not require explanation. Lucas continued to play in official spaces, though less frequently, and when he did, he maintained familiar patterns, avoiding anything that might provoke suspicion. Officers appeared distracted, preoccupied with their own uncertainties, and this distraction created space, yet Lucas did not relax his vigilance. He understood that transitions were dangerous, because overconfidence could undo years of careful work. The resistance leaders consulted him, often now asking not only what he carried, but what he sensed, and Lucas learned to trust his intuition, shaped by years of listening. He spoke when something felt wrong, even if evidence was thin, and his warnings were taken seriously, because his accuracy had earned that trust. During this time, he also began documenting his memory techniques, verbally teaching them to others who might need them in the future. He did not frame this as legacy, but as continuity because he knew that no role should depend on one person alone. Training others brought him quiet satisfaction and reminded him that knowledge shared reduced fear. There were moments when exhaustion returned, yet it no longer felt heavy because purpose had become integrated into his identity. He no longer questioned whether he could continue because stopping no longer felt like an option. As news of approaching liberation spread quietly, Lucas carried messages that spoke of restraint and coordination, reminding people that patience mattered until certainty arrived. He understood that joy could be as destabilizing as fear if it outran discipline. The final weeks before change were the hardest because waiting tested resolve more than action, and Lucas held steady, guiding others through calm consistency. When the first signs of withdrawal appeared, he noted the change in sound: immediately fewer boots, fewer commands, more space between movements. The resistance moved carefully, and Lucas' role narrowed, focusing on confirmation rather than instruction. When liberation finally arrived, it did so unevenly, and without ceremony, and Lucas listened as the town transformed in sound and emotion. There was no sudden release, only a gradual easing, and he understood that recovery would take time. His work did not end with the war because memory does not disappear when danger passes. He continued to support others, sharing techniques, helping rebuild systems, and offering presence rather than heroism. As life began to reshape itself, Lucas remained grounded, aware that identity forged in crisis required careful transition. He allowed himself moments of rest without guilt and returned to music as expression rather than function. This stage of his life marked not an ending but a recalibration, and he moved forward with humility shaped by experience and restraint. The world opened slowly, and Lucas stepped into it, guided not by sight, but by understanding built through years of listening, purpose, and choice. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. After liberation, the silence that followed felt unfamiliar to Lucas, because for years sound had carried urgency, purpose, and danger, and now it carried something softer, uncertain, and open, and this openness required adjustment. People spoke more freely, yet their voices held layers of grief, relief, and disbelief. And Lucas listened carefully, understanding that freedom did not erase memory, it simply changed how it lived inside people. The resistance dissolved gradually, not with declarations, but with quiet decisions as individuals returned to families, work, and rebuilding. And Lucas felt both pride and loss as the network he had served faded into ordinary life. He was thanked privately by a few who understood his role, but there were no ceremonies, and he did not expect any because anonymity had protected him, and now it preserved balance. His parents struggled with the transition more than he did because fear had shaped their routines, and releasing it left emptiness, and Lucas supported them by restoring simple rhythms: meals, walks, shared listening. Music returned to their home not as code, but as presence, and Lucas played freely again, exploring pieces without restraint, allowing emotion to move without calculation. This freedom felt strange at first because discipline had governed his hands for so long, yet gradually, joy returned not as excitement, but as calm. The town rebuilt unevenly, and scars remained both visible and hidden, and Lucas noticed how sound changed with reconstruction: new tools, new movement, new conversations. He was invited to teach music to children and adults who had lost access during the war, and he accepted, because sharing sound felt like continuity rather than obligation. Teaching required patience of a different kind, and Lucas learned to describe music in ways that invited rather than instructed, helping others listen inwardly. Some students knew fragments of his story and others knew nothing, and he treated them all the same because music did not require explanation. There were nights when memory returned sharply, bringing back tension and responsibility, and Lucas learned to sit with those memories without pushing them away. He understood now that healing was not forgetting but integrating, and he allowed the past to exist without defining his present. Former resistance members gathered, occasionally sharing stories in silence, and Lucas listened more than he spoke, offering grounding rather than recollection. He was asked once to speak publicly about his role, and he declined, gently believing that some stories served best as foundations rather than banners. His blindness no longer felt like limitation or advantage, it was simply part of how he moved through the world, and he embraced it without analysis. As years passed, Lucas became known quietly as a teacher, musician, and listener, and people sought his presence not for what he had done, but for how he listened. He rebuilt his life with intention, choosing simplicity, connection, and service over recognition. The music he played carried depth shaped by experience, and those who listened felt it even if they could not name why. This stage of his life was marked by continuity rather than climax, and he found fulfillment in that steadiness. He understood that resistance did not always require opposition, Sometimes, it meant preservation of humanity through attention, care, and sound. He carried forward the lessons learned not as weight, but as guidance shaping choices without urgency. The world moved on, and Lucas moved with it, grounded, present, and open to what came next. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. In the later years of his life, Lucas reached a place of quiet completeness that did not announce itself through achievement or recognition, but through the way each day settled naturally into the next without resistance. He lived in a modest home filled with sound rather than objects, and every room carried memory not as burden, but as texture, shaping how he moved and listened. Music remained central, yet it no longer carried responsibility or risk, and this freedom allowed Lucas to explore tone, emotion, and silence in ways he never could during the war. He played in the mornings when the world felt open, and in the evenings when reflection came easily, and sometimes he sat without touching the keys, listening to the environment as a form of music itself. His students came and went, carrying pieces of his teaching forward into their own lives, and Lucas measured success not by their skill, but by their attentiveness. He taught them that listening was an act of respect, and that sound revealed truth when approached with patience. Many never knew the full extent of what he had done, and those who did understood why he never spoke of it openly. His story existed quietly in fragments, passed carefully between those who valued discretion, and this suited Lucas because the work had never been about recognition. As age slowed his movements, his inner world remained active and precise, and memory stayed sharp, shaped by years of disciplined practice. He reflected often on how blindness had guided him toward sound, and how sound had guided him toward purpose, and how purpose had shaped character. He did not romanticize the past, and he did not regret it because each choice had been made with awareness and intention. When asked what gave his life meaning, Lucas answered simply that he listened when listening was needed, and acted when action was required. The world around him continued to change, and new generations faced different struggles. Yet Lucas believed that the principles of attention, discipline, and integrity remained constant. In his final years, he recorded some of his memory techniques not as history, but as tools for anyone who might need them, and he shared them freely. He spent time with family, friends, and former students, finding fulfillment in presence rather than legacy. When he played for small gatherings, people often remarked on the depth of his music, and Lucas smiled, knowing that depth came from experience rather than talent. He understood that the messages he once carried had long since fulfilled their purpose, yet the act of carrying them had shaped him permanently. In quiet moments, he thought of those who had not survived and honored them by living fully with care and humility. His life stood as proof that resistance could take many forms, and that courage did not require visibility. When Lucas passed, he did so quietly, surrounded by sound, breath, and familiarity, and those who knew him felt not loss alone but gratitude. His story continued not in monuments or records, but in the listening of those he had taught and the choices they made. What began as music used to hide truth had ended as music that revealed humanity, and in that arc his life found its meaning and its rest. His life found its meaning and its rest. He was born in a small town where sound mattered more than sight, long before anyone knew that darkness would become permanent in his life. And from the beginning his world was shaped by voices, footsteps, wind moving through narrow streets, and music drifting from open windows. His name was Lucas, and as a child he could see shadows and light. But even then his eyes tired easily, and doctors spoke in careful tones, telling his parents that his vision would fade with time, and that one day he would live entirely through sound, touch, and memory. His parents were ordinary people. His father repaired instruments and radios, and his mother worked long hours sewing clothes, and they refused to treat him as fragile, because they believed strength came from routine and trust. Music entered Lucas' life not as therapy, but as companionship, because when his father worked, he let Lucas sit nearby and listen to strings being tightened, keys being tested, and melodies being repeated until they were right. Lucas learned early that every sound had a pattern, and every pattern had meaning, and he began to recognize notes not just by pitch, but by feeling how they settled in his chest. As his vision weakened, his hearing sharpened, and he memorized melodies faster than others could read them. And this ability amazed teachers, but worried his parents, who feared attention would bring pressure. By the time he lost his sight completely, music had become his map, and the piano his language, and he could navigate rooms by echoes and recognize people by the way they breathed before speaking. The country around him was changing though, and tension crept into daily life. As uniforms became common and voices lowered in public places, and fear hid behind polite smiles. Lucas was still young when occupation began, and with it came rules, curfews, and silent resistance that moved through kitchens, basements, and back rooms, carried by people who refused to surrender their dignity. He did not understand politics fully, but he understood fear because it changed the sound of footsteps and the rhythm of speech, and he sensed when his parents whispered late at night. When soldiers entered their town, Lucas heard them before he knew who they were, their boots heavy, deliberate, and their voices sharp with command, and something inside him closed quietly. His father was questioned often because instruments were considered suspicious tools and radios dangerous, and Lucas learned to sit still and silent, listening to conversations that carried more weight than words. As time passed, his father began repairing pianos for officers who wanted music in their quarters, and Lucas was sometimes brought along because no one suspected a blind boy of paying attention. What they did not know was that Lucas listened to everything and stored it away: sounds, names, rhythms, accents, and sequences, forming patterns in his mind. At night, his father taught him how to break melodies into pieces and how to remember long sequences by turning them into music, and this became more than practice, it became preparation. The resistance grew quietly, and messages needed to move without paper, without speech, and without leaving traces, and someone noticed that Lucas' memory was unlike anything they had seen. They tested him gently at first, asking him to repeat long strings of information, and he did not struggle because he translated words into notes and rhythms that stayed alive in his mind. When they realized what he could do, they hesitated because involving him meant risk and danger, but Lucas made the choice himself, saying that blindness did not mean helplessness, and that listening was his strength. He began memorizing messages that could not be written: names, locations, times, warnings, and instructions, and he carried them inside him without knowing their full meaning, only their structure. The piano became the safest place to release these messages because music flowed freely, and officers welcomed it, never suspecting that beneath familiar melodies information was moving. Lucas practiced encoding messages into variations, tempo changes, and subtle shifts that only those trained to hear them could understand, and he practiced until it felt natural. He knew that one mistake could cost lives, and that knowledge weighed on him, but fear did not stop him because purpose had replaced uncertainty. This was the beginning of a life lived between silence and sound, between danger and duty. And though he could not see the world, he was shaping it through memory, courage, and music. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. As Lucas grew older, the weight of responsibility settled into his daily life without ceremony and without praise. And he accepted it as naturally as he accepted darkness, because both had become familiar companions. Each morning began with listening before movement. As he lay still, mapping the house through sound, the quiet breathing of his mother, the distant creak of floorboards, the hum of the street waking beyond the walls. His father no longer spoke openly, even inside the home, and Lucas learned to understand meaning from tone rather than words, because silence itself had become a language. The resistance contact visited less often, but when he did, his presence carried urgency, and Lucas sensed it immediately in the way his chair scraped the floor and the way his breath shortened. Messages became longer and more complex, no longer simple warnings, but layered instructions involving routes, safe houses, and shifting plans that changed daily. Lucas adapted by building entire musical structures in his mind, assigning themes to locations, rhythms to timing, and harmonies to people, so that nothing existed alone, everything connected. He practiced constantly, not at the piano, but inside himself, replaying sequences while walking, while eating, while lying awake at night, ensuring nothing faded or blurred. Fear existed, but it lived quietly because panic would fracture memory, and Lucas understood that calm was not bravery but discipline. When he played for officers, the rooms were often tense yet unaware, and he could feel attention resting on him, not with suspicion, but indulgence, as if he were harmless entertainment. They spoke freely around him, assuming blindness meant absence, and Lucas absorbed accents, ranks, habits, and emotional shifts, storing them alongside the coded messages. Some officers requested the same pieces repeatedly, and Lucas used that familiarity to hide variations, slipping altered phrases into trusted melodies, knowing the trained listeners outside would catch them. The resistance listeners positioned themselves carefully, sometimes as servants, sometimes as distant neighbors, and they learned to hear what others could not. One evening, a message involved an imminent raid, and Lucas felt the pressure of time as he played, knowing lives depended on accuracy and restraint. His hands moved steadily, and his breathing remained even, and when the final note faded, the coded warning had already traveled beyond the room. Later, he learned that the message had saved several families, and that knowledge did not bring pride but resolve, because success raised expectations. His parents lived with constant fear, yet never asked him to stop because they saw how purpose steadied him, and how denying it would break something deeper. The town changed further as shortages grew and suspicion thickened, and music became one of the few acceptable comforts allowed by those in control. Lucas was moved between locations, sometimes playing in private homes, sometimes in official halls, and each move required recalibration of acoustics and risk. He memorized rooms as carefully as messages, noting how sound traveled where echoes lingered, and how footsteps revealed proximity. Once a soldier questioned why he played certain variations, and Lucas answered simply that he played what he felt, and the answer satisfied the man because it fit his assumptions. At night, Lucas dreamed not of images, but of soundscapes layered and complex, and sometimes he woke unsure whether a melody had been played or imagined. The resistance debated whether to continue using him because the risk grew, but Lucas insisted, because stopping would draw more attention than continuing. He learned that courage was not loud or dramatic but repetitive and exhausting, and that each successful day demanded the same care as the first. By the end of that year, Lucas was no longer just a messenger, but a symbol known quietly among those who listened and trusted. He carried the burden without complaint, understanding that if he faltered, others would fall, and that knowledge sharpened his focus. The war pressed closer and danger thickened, but so did connection, and Lucas understood that though he could not see faces, he was bound to many lives through sound. His role had grown beyond expectation, and the path ahead promised no safety, only necessity. And yet he moved forward because there was no other honest choice. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content. Without them, as the months passed, Lucas' life became shaped by rhythm rather than calendar. And he measured time through repetition of tasks, sounds, and responsibilities rather than days or dates. And this way of living helped him remain steady in a world that kept shifting beneath everyone else. He learned to wake before dawn, not because of duty, but because the town sounded different then, and those quiet hours allowed him to review the messages he carried, letting them move through his mind in careful order, checking each sequence again and again, until it felt settled. His mother began to worry less about his blindness and more about the danger surrounding him, yet she never spoke of it directly because fear spoken aloud gained strength, and she refused to give it that power. His father grew older faster under the weight of occupation and secrecy, and Lucas could hear the fatigue in his movements, yet also the pride he tried to hide whenever Lucas played with control and purpose. The resistance relied on routines to avoid suspicion, and Lucas became part of those routines, performing regularly in places where officers gathered and where comfort disguised control. He memorized not only messages, but patterns of behavior, learning which officers lingered, which ones drank too much, and which ones listened too closely. This awareness helped him adjust performances in real time, choosing simpler codes when danger felt near and more complex ones when the room relaxed. There were moments when his hands shook slightly, and he learned to anchor himself through breath and posture, because even small changes in sound could be noticed. He trained his memory, constantly developing techniques that allowed him to store hundreds of details without confusion, and he learned that emotion had to be separated from information until the moment of release. Sometimes he carried messages that spoke of loss, arrests, or executions, and those weighed heavily, yet he did not allow them to break his focus because grief without discipline could ruin everything. The resistance leaders debated often about whether it was ethical to place so much burden on one person, especially someone so young and vulnerable. Yet Lucas remained firm in his choice. He told them that blindness had taught him reliance on others, and that this was his way of giving back, not as a symbol, but as a participant. He did not seek recognition, and in fact preferred anonymity, because it allowed him to exist quietly between roles, son, musician, and messenger. As the war intensified, checkpoints multiplied and movement became restricted, yet music remained one of the few freedoms tolerated, and this contradiction protected him. One night an officer requested a private performance, and Lucas sensed unease in the room from the way sound pressed inward, and he adjusted by playing without code, understanding that safety sometimes meant restraint. Another night, the coded message carried instructions that altered an entire supply route, and he felt the gravity of that responsibility settle into his chest. He began to experience moments of exhaustion, not physical but mental, and during those times, he relied on discipline, trusting his preparation more than his feelings. The resistance adapted, alongside him, refining how they listened and responded, and the system became more fluid, more resilient. Lucas learned that his role required not only memory, but trust, and that trust moved both ways because those who relied on him had to believe he would not falter. He carried that belief, carefully protecting it through routine, honesty, and self-control. Though danger increased, his resolve deepened, and he accepted that survival was uncertain, but meaning was not. His life had become a quiet balance of risk and purpose, and though the darkness remained complete within his eyes, his inner world was sharp, focused, and alive. This chapter of his life closed not with relief, but with readiness, because the path ahead demanded even greater care and commitment. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content. Without them, as the conflict deepened, Lucas found that his inner world grew more structured, even as the outer world became more chaotic. and this contrast helped him endure days that felt heavier than those before. He began to sense danger not as fear, but as distortion when familiar sounds lost balance, or when voices carried tension beneath polite tones, and this sensitivity became another tool he relied on. The resistance expanded its network, and with growth came complexity, because more people meant more messages, more timing, more risk, and Lucas adapted by refining his internal system. He divided information into layers, storing surface melodies that anyone could hear beneath, which lived deeper patterns only meant for trained listeners. And this mental architecture allowed him to protect clarity even under pressure. There were days when he carried more than a dozen messages within him, each one assigned to a specific performance and location, and he rehearsed transitions silently so nothing overlapped. Officers grew more confident as their control tightened, and this confidence made them careless speaking openly in his presence, and Lucas absorbed their words without judgment. He learned ranks by cadence, authority by pacing, and intent by pauses, and though he could not see insignia, he could hear hierarchy. One evening, an officer stood unusually close, and Lucas adjusted his posture and tempo to project calm, knowing that suspicion fed on irregularity. The performance ended without incident, yet the tension lingered, and later, he learned that inspections had followed, narrowly missing a resistance cell. That night he slept poorly and woke repeatedly replaying sound sequences, until morning light warmed the room and his mother brewed tea without speaking. The emotional cost of his work began to surface not as breakdown, but as quiet weight, and Lucas learned to release it through controlled practice sessions, where he played freely without code. These moments reminded him why he loved music beyond its function, and they restored balance within him. The resistance leaders noticed his strain and suggested rest, but he declined, understanding that absence would raise questions and disrupt the fragile system. Instead, he adjusted his schedule, allowing brief windows of solitude where he could walk familiar routes and listen to the town breathe. The town itself felt altered, walls held memory, footsteps echoed with history, and Lucas sensed loss in the silence between sounds. One day he memorized a message that carried news of betrayal within the network, and the knowledge shook him because trust was the foundation of everything. He delivered the message with precision and later learned that it prevented greater harm, though the cost was heavy. This experience taught him that courage was not only about facing danger, but about accepting difficult truths. As months passed, Lucas matured beyond his years, and those around him treated him with quiet respect, though they rarely spoke it. He understood now that his blindness had removed distractions, leaving him with focus and presence that others struggled to maintain. The system they built continued to function under strain, adapting to increased patrols and surveillance, and Lucas remained central to its flow. Each successful transmission reinforced his belief that sound carried power beyond entertainment or comfort. He knew that the war would not last forever, yet he also knew that its impact would shape him permanently. This phase of his journey marked a shift from survival to endurance, and from learning to mastery. He was no longer testing his abilities, but living within them, fully aware of the stakes, and prepared to carry them forward. The path ahead promised greater risk and deeper consequence, yet Lucas remained steady because purpose had become part of his identity. He moved forward guided by disciplined memory, and a quiet, unwavering resolve that did not require sight to see its direction. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. As the fourth year of occupation settled over the town, the atmosphere thickened in a way Lucas could sense even without sight, because tension altered sound itself, and conversations shortened, doors closed more quickly, and footsteps hurried, as if the ground no longer felt safe. The resistance had lost several routes, and with each loss, the remaining channels carried greater weight, and Lucas found himself holding more responsibility than ever before, not because anyone demanded it, but because necessity left no alternatives. His role shifted from simply carrying messages to helping design how those messages moved, and he worked closely with a small inner circle whose voices he knew as well as his own thoughts. They met rarely and always briefly, exchanging information in coded speech that blended into ordinary conversation, and Lucas contributed by suggesting musical structures that could hold more information without drawing attention. This collaboration challenged him in new ways because it required anticipation and strategy rather than reaction, and he embraced it with careful focus. The danger increased as officers began to suspect that information was leaking through unconventional means, and inspections grew more frequent and invasive. Lucas adapted by reducing complexity during performances, relying on shorter codes repeated across different pieces, so that no single moment carried full meaning. This adjustment demanded even greater memory control, and he practiced tirelessly, reinforcing sequences until they felt unbreakable. His parents noticed the strain, though Lucas tried to shield them, and his mother worried about his health, while his father worried about the risks they could not control. Despite this, Lucas refused to step back, believing that withdrawing would expose others and unravel fragile systems built on trust. One night, soldiers searched their home, questioning his father and overturning belongings, and Lucas sat silently listening to every movement, his mind alert and steady. The soldiers found nothing and left, but the sound of their boots lingered long after, and that night Lucas did not sleep. The resistance debated moving him to a safer location, but Lucas resisted, knowing that displacement would disrupt routines and increase suspicion. He understood that safety was relative, and that familiarity often offered the best protection. As losses mounted, Lucas carried news that weighed heavily, and he learned to separate delivery from judgment, knowing that emotional reaction could compromise clarity. He also learned that silence could be as powerful as sound, and that sometimes not playing carried its own message. During a period of heightened alert, he performed without code for weeks, maintaining appearances, while others restructured networks behind the scenes. This restraint tested his patience but reinforced discipline, and when codes resumed, they did so with renewed precision. The pressure revealed cracks in some relationships and strengthened others, and Lucas learned to trust fewer voices more deeply. He began mentoring a younger resistance member, teaching memory techniques and sound awareness, and this act grounded him, reminding him that knowledge shared multiplied resilience. The younger member admired Lucas not for his blindness or bravery, but for his calm consistency, and that respect mattered more than praise. As winter approached, resources dwindled and morale wavered, yet music continued to offer moments of unity, and Lucas' performances carried a steadiness that comforted listeners, even when they did not know. He realized then that his work held dual meaning, practical and emotional, and that both were necessary for endurance. The thread of discovery remained constant, yet Lucas accepted it fully, understanding that fear acknowledged lost its grip. This phase of his journey deepened his understanding of sacrifice, not as loss alone, but as sustained commitment. He no longer measured success by survival alone, but by integrity maintained under pressure. The world outside continued to fracture, but within himself, Lucas found a clarity that guided him through uncertainty. The path ahead promised no easing of danger, only transformation, and he stood ready, grounded in sound, memory, and purpose. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. Dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them.